Right now, somewhere in your city, a person is sitting in a room surrounded by more human beings than any ancestor of theirs ever saw in a lifetime. They have a device in their pocket that connects them to 3 billion people. They have not had a real conversation in 4 days, and they cannot tell you exactly when it started. Loneliness is the most common human experience of the modern world. It is also, by every measure we have, one of the most lethal. It raises your risk of early death by 26%. It damages the immune system, disrupts sleep, accelerates cognitive decline. Chronic loneliness produces the same physiological stress response as being punched in the face, repeatedly with no way to stop it. Researchers at Brigham Young University reviewed 148 studies and found that weak social connection is as dangerous to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And yet nobody designed it this way. Nobody sat down and decided to make a world that would leave people this isolated. It happened slowly, in steps, each one looking like progress. And to understand how we got here, you have to go back to a time when loneliness as we experience it today was not just rare. It was structurally impossible. For 300,000 years, you could not be alone even if you wanted to be. Your entire existence unfolded inside a band of roughly 25 to 50 people. You were born into them. You ate with them every night. You slept within arm's reach of several of them at once. You knew the sound of every person's breathing. You knew which elder snored and which child cried out in the night and which hunter ground his teeth in his sleep. Privacy, as a concept, did not exist. Solitude was not something you chose. It was something that happened to you briefly, by accident, when you wandered too far from camp to relieve yourself. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups consistently report the same thing. Personal space is almost non-existent. Physical contact between adults is constant and unremarkable. A man lying with his head in another man's lap while they talk. Women grooming each other's hair while their children play across their legs. Elderly people sleeping pressed against grandchildren because the warmth is practical and nobody thinks twice about it. This was not a cultural preference. This was the human factory setting. Your nervous system was calibrated inside this world. It expects proximity. It expects familiar voices. It expects to fall asleep knowing exactly where the people it loves are located in the dark. When those things are absent, your body does not interpret this as freedom or independence. It interprets it as a threat. It reads isolation the same way it reads predator, because for most of human history, that is exactly what isolation was. A person alone in the wild was a person about to die. The anxiety you feel when you go too long without real human contact is not weakness. It is a perfectly accurate alarm system that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. It is your body telling you something that your culture keeps insisting isn't true. The first crack appeared roughly 10,000 years ago with agriculture. Before farming, the group moved. You followed the food, the seasons, the animals. Movement kept the band together because survival required everyone. There was no one you could leave behind. There was no structure that let you accumulate more than someone else. Surplus was impossible when you carried everything you owned. Agriculture changed that. For the first time, people stayed in one place. Land had owners, grain could be stored, wealth could accumulate in one family's hands and not another's. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and for the first time in human history, you could live surrounded by thousands of strangers, people whose names you did not know and whose histories you would never learn. But the deeper change was slower and harder to see. In a band, your identity was inseparable from the group. You were not an individual who happened to belong to people. You were the people. Your survival, your reputation, your meaning, all of it lived in the web of relationships you shared. The Jew Huanzi Bushmen of the Kalahari have no word for a person that does not also imply their connections. In their language, to name someone is to name where they belong. That understanding began to erode the moment land could be owned and passed down. Inheritance required individuals. Contracts required individuals. Law required individuals. The self, as a separate unit that exists apart from its relationships, is not a discovery. It is an invention, and it was invented for economic reasons. The loneliness we now recognize did not have a name until the 18th century. The word lonely, in its modern sense, meaning the painful awareness of one's own isolation, barely appears in English writing before 1800. Historians have found almost no references to it in medieval literature, in ancient texts, in the records of people living in earlier centuries, not because they didn't have feelings, but because the condition it describes was rare enough that it didn't need a word. What changed in the 1800s was industrialization. People left villages where their families had lived for generations and moved to cities to work in factories. They moved into rooming houses among strangers. They worked shifts that made synchronizing time with family nearly impossible. The old webs of obligation, the neighbor who brought food when you were sick, the cousin who sat with you through a hard night, the village that showed up when the roof needed repairing, began to snap, one thread at a time. And then something subtler happened. The home shrank. For most of human history, the house was not a private retreat. It was a porous social space. Neighbors walked in without knocking. Extended families slept under the same roof across multiple generations. Children moved freely between households. In 17th century England, even middle-class homes routinely housed servants, apprentices, and lodgers alongside the family. The idea that a household was just parents and children sealed Sealed off from the world behind a closed door would have seemed bizarre and faintly alarming to most people in history. The nuclear family is not an ancient unit. It is a modern experiment, and it placed an impossible weight on two people who were now expected to be everything to each other: best friend, lover, co-parent, financial partner, emotional support, and primary social world, all at once, indefinitely. By the 20th century, the architecture of daily life had been redesigned around separation. Cars replaced walking. You no longer passed your neighbors on the way to the market. You drove past them in a sealed metal box and arrived somewhere else. Suburbs spread people across vast distances, and the design of those suburbs made accidental human contact nearly impossible. There were no town squares, no markets, no natural gathering places. There were lawns, and everyone stayed on their own. Television moved social life indoors permanently. Instead of gathering in public houses or on front porches or in communal spaces to share stories, people sat in private rooms and watched other people perform life on a screen. The ritual of collective storytelling, one of the oldest and most neurologically important things humans do together, became a solitary act. Then came the internet, and then the smartphone. The loneliest generation in recorded history is also the most connected by every technological measure that has ever existed. A 2023 report from the U.S. Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic. It found that 50% of American adults reported measurable loneliness. Among adults under 34, the numbers were higher. Among people who reported heavy social media use, higher still. What the technology gave us was contact without presence, the sensation of being seen without the reality of being known, 1,000 interactions that together add up to less than 1 hour sitting next to someone who knows your full history and doesn't need you to perform anything. Your body knows the difference. Researchers at UCLA studying social pain found that loneliness activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain does not file these experiences in separate categories. Rejection and a broken bone show up in the same region. Exclusion triggers the same inflammation response as an infection. The body treats the absence of human connection as an injury because, over the time scale it was built on, that is precisely what it is. And here is the part that stays with you. The loneliness epidemic is worse not among the elderly, not among the isolated, not among the poor, but among young people living in dense cities with full social calendars and hundreds of people reachable by phone at any moment. They are surrounded. They are starving. There is a word in the Bantu languages of Southern Africa, Ubuntu, that is sometimes translated as "I am because we are." It is not a philosophy. It is not a slogan. It is a description of how those societies understand personhood itself. You do not exist as a full human being outside your relationships. Your humanity is something that happens between you and others, not inside you alone. We moved so far from that understanding that we forgot it was ever the default. We built an entire civilization on the opposite assumption that the individual is the fundamental unit, that self-sufficiency is the goal, that needing others is a weakness to be managed rather than a biological fact to be honored. And then we wonder why so many people, in rooms full of light, with every comfort their ancestors could not have imagined, feel a hollow thing spreading quietly through the center of their days. The loneliness epidemic is not a failure of individuals. It is the accumulated consequence of 10,000 small decisions, economic, architectural, technological, and philosophical, that each made perfect sense in isolation and together produced something nobody chose. Your ancestors did not have a word for this feeling because their world did not allow it to exist. We built a world that manufactures it, and most of us are still trying to fix it with the same tools that made it.